Dingiwala, hello. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us here. It's important, of course, before we begin to always affirm and honour that we are meeting here on Kulin land. The Boonwurrung, Woiwurrung peoples have long and deep histories in this place, very storied histories that we are all stepping into as guests, despite being blackfellas in this stage, in this festival. This isn't our land, and so I know everybody here sitting beside me takes that responsibility to honour the ongoing custodianship of country very deeply. It's a really strong and important part of their work and their relationships, not just to the places where they live, but also, the honour to their own communities. And so when we pay that respect, it is the respect that we also would want and expect to be paid to our homelands. I'm Evelyn Araluen, but I also really don't matter in this conversation. So we're going to move past that very swiftly. We are joined by three incredible writers who work across a multitude of forms and mediums and have been writing incredible works in those forms for many decades. And to be polite, I'm not going to say how many collectively between everybody here. As a younger person, I can't say how honoured I am to be given the opportunity to speak to these true, these true leaders in their fields. We love and admire all of the young ones coming into the community and into the space, but the reason that those spaces are available, that they are welcoming and nurtured spaces, is because of the work of our elders in literature and the arts and in broader Aboriginal culture. So it's not necessarily a part of today's, the thematic theme of today's discussion, but I really do want to put an emphasis on the importance of resisting narratives of ageism and emergence in our literary culture and really recognise the richness that actually does come from mob who know what they're doing. And they had to learn what to do in harsher circumstances, and the ones who, those of us who now get to benefit from that knowledge of experience. So beginning with that note, I just want to say what a privilege it is to have these incredible three speakers here. They're briefest of introductions, because if you don't know who they are, then that's awkward for yous. So we have to my immediate right, we've got Aunty Julie Jetta Danson. She's a Burrabarongal woman from Darug Nation, Western Sydney, as somebody who was born and raised in Burrabarongal country. It's a great privilege to be sharing the stage with you. I'll be cute and charming and call you Uncle Kim, but I don't want to force you into whichever. Yeah, cute and charming. The great, of course, Uncle Kim Scott, who is a Noongar writer, teacher, academic, and also cultural worker with Wirramalin Language Project. And then to the far right, we've got Aunty Janine Lane, who is a Wiradjuri woman from Gundagai, Murrumbidgee River, and she is a writer, poet, critic, academic, teacher, kind of everything, and has worked across every single form, and I think is pretty much effectively about to have a book in every single form if she doesn't have that already. So a real honour to be able to share the stage with you all. The format that we're going for here is essentially, I'm a little language and writing and craft nerd, and I've managed to somehow produce a situation in which I get to ask three people who know way more than I do about writing, all kinds of little fussy particular sorts of questions. So this is a delight for me, and you all just happen to be sitting here in the audience. So hopefully you enjoy that, and if you don't, I'm sorry, we'll see how that goes. So each of the speakers here are also invited and encouraged to ask questions to each other. So if at some point I just get ignored entirely in this panel, don't worry, that's intentional, that's what we want. So, beginning immediately to my right. Hello, how are you? Not you. Yes, hello, Ani. Hi, how are you?
Oh, happy to be here, thank you.
Beautiful, good. So you've worked for many years across the page and the stage. And so my first question for you is really to ask us about the relationship between those mediums and whether you feel some stories are more meant for the embodied nature of performance and whether some stories are more appropriate for you in your practice on the page.
Okay. Before I say that, I'll acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country of the Wurrung Nation, and I'm very pleased and happy to be invited here to Victoria. I give you greetings in a Darug language, which is Kwaibidja, Jamna Payala Janawi, come together in peace to talk. Look, that's a great question. I've known Evelyn for a little while. She's an amazing brain, so I always kind of a bit sort of flustered when she asks me a question because it's so in-depth. But I'm not often asked about page to stage, but I think if I hadn't written the 10 plays that I had before I became a novelist and a poet, I wouldn't have the skills, especially in dialogue and in bringing to life on the page human characters that are believable, but also have that theatricality and the ability to be poetic in their own way. And I think if I hadn't had that theatre background and that wonderful opportunity to work with some extraordinary Indigenous students, I was a lecturer at Sydney Uni for 20 years and a teacher for 40 years, and I taught a lot of drama, and we did a lot of improvisation, and improvisation allows that deep creative sense to come out of your mouth when you're not thinking about it, and it's kind of a subconscious creativity, and I believe in those kind of methods when I'm creating my own characters. But look, I stand on the shoulders of some of the great Aboriginal actors and writers, Ava Johnson, wonderful playwright, Bobby Merritt, the fantastic Jack Davis, and the wonderful actors I've worked with, Lillian Crombie, Justine Saunders, Kevin Smith, and also Billy McPherson, who is still a great mate of mine, attends all my book readings with his didgeridoo and absolutely steals the show every time he comes. But I think that past work in writing for the stage has really allowed me to give voice to my novels. And when I first started to get published by the wonderful Muggabulla, of whom I always pay great tribute to, because without Muggabulla I would never have been published. Funny, I've only ever been published in West Australia, and I only ever write about New South Wales, so all I can think of is West Australia. They think I'm exotic, you know. So, and one of the first editors I had from Muggabulla said, "I want you to get rid of some of that dialogue." And, you know, I was really kind of pretty desperate to get published. It's like if she'd said, you know, I almost would have done anything. And I said, look, I'll cut out just a little bit. And I cut out about 3 words from the dialogue, you know. I said, you can do whatever you want for the rest of the novel, but don't touch the dialogue. And I still feel that. But, yeah, without dialogue, my characters don't come to life. So the two forms are very much connected. And without poetry, I wouldn't have learnt to really hone down the essence of a sentence into what is really needed to be there, and also the musicality and the rhythm of the words, and you get that from writing poetry. So any young or beginning writer in the room, practice with poetry. It's a fantastic way to hone your skills. Thanks for the question.
Also, I totally agree, practice with poetry. I wrote a book and it was very much practicing poetry, so, you know, I concur. All right, Uncle Kim, so your body of work, reading that as a dialogue with Noongar community and Noongar history especially, and the cues that it does take from those relationships that you've built and developed and that you continue to maintain. My question to you in terms of craft is really about, you know, the work that you put into the clarification and the technique behind your own voice, because you are also an academic, and how you feel, you know, how much control you feel that you do have over that, given the cultural priority and mandate that is constantly acting upon your practice with your relationship with you know, Noongar language, but also that community work and development.
Well, big question.
That's what I'm here for.
I'm nervous here, and I'm trying to remember what. So dialogue with Noongar community and how that fits.
Well, you're a very precise and technical creative writer, but you're also one constantly acting in a cultural mandate, I feel, as a reader, and I've heard you speak in context where you're thinking about how your work has developed from book to book and how that is inflected by your relationships with the broader Noongar community. Yeah.
Yep. You mentioned being precise, etc. That may be the case, but I think the comments we've already had about improvisation and practicing with poetry, what the rhythms therein in both those sort of practice, I think that's extremely important to me. And then later it's shaping to try and get things right. Yes, the relationship with the Noongar community. I wrote a novel, Benang, saying I may well be the first successfully white man born in the family line, which I'm proud of starting like that. It was in an age of, that was in the 90s, fraud, hoax and appropriation. At the time, over the road from where I was working, running an Aboriginal bridging course, there was a Noongar Inquisition of Madruru Noongar. And it seemed to me that there was a lot of incentive to be a convenient sort of blackfella and an angry one for the purposes of the academy. And if I was at all able I was trying to be a novelist, it was my second novel, then I should take on the language of the archives, which I'd just discovered. So that was an early part of that sort of dynamic. But then I have people, Noongar people saying, well, Kim, brother, I picked up that book of yours yesterday and I got about 50 pages in. It was too hard for me. I give it away. So, and winning, and the first Indigenous writer to win the Miles Franklin, and you think, I've done something wrong, perhaps. So those things do affect me, and it's developed. So I do a book with a Noongar elder. Then you realise all the things that don't fit in a book like that. So Auntie Hazel, and this is something we continue to work with, had sat by her father's sickbed and in an exercise book had written a 500-700 word list, her own sort of spelling, wanting, when it was still in the era of degradation and denigration, wanting to keep that alive. And so that's a lot of the language work has come from there. And I could continue, but that might be a bit long. Have I gone on a bit long here?
No.
All right.
I reckon you can continue. If you take too much time, we'll make it up somewhere else. Don't worry.
I said to you, shut me
points.
up. I get nervy and I talk too much. So, I work, a little group of us, so Auntie Hazel's siblings. So this is a group of elders who claimed me generations back, realising there's a brother and a sister. My great-grandmother was the sister living in a town infamous for a massacre occurring in that region and regarded by many Aboriginal people as taboo. This bunch of siblings claim me through the Noongar name of that little family. So that sets up certain, for me, that set up certain responsibilities. And Auntie Hay, and they show me sites. This is an era of native title, so they pushed me on with Auntie Hazel's brother representing the extended family and the working party. So going through that, I find it difficult to withdraw just for the aesthetic pleasure, as much as I get joy from that, of just shaping words on the page. So that's also part of that dynamic. And then I think That Dead Man Dance was a book looking at what can I find from first contact about who I am, who we are at the so-called friendly frontier, this horribly glib line in my hometown. And that was to try and enlarge upon the great generosity and humanity and creative ability to improvise and play with language that Noongar people in that area demonstrated. Playing with the literary form of the expedition journal you see that written. Learning songs and learning English. So much so that, and this is still hard for me to work out, particularly in writing that goes beyond our little space there on the south coast. When the colonisers first arrived to claim the land, it was hold it as a military garrison against the French, some of the historians say, because the French had been hanging around, as had the English, for a couple of decades. So when this fella, Major Lockerbie is called, sets foot on the shore, a Noongar man greets him, bonjour, if that's how you say the word, greets him in the French language. Now that, and I was trying to work with this, and this sort of impulse in that Dead Man Dance, that cross-cultural sophistication to make the other feel comfortable, that was part of the dynamic with Noongar community. Look how talented, look how wonderful our heritage is. Let's not get trapped in, let's not get hijacked by the genre of military history and reduce it to this to and fro. That's part of a dialogue with Noongar community. I'll stop there. Eh?
Thank you. Thank you. All right, and Auntie Janine, so you are a creative, educational, cultural practitioner across a multitude of forms and mediums. You know, you began your career as an educator and you worked in secondary context for many years, and then you were working at a university, and alongside that you were writing poetry, fiction, essay, non-fiction. At the moment, your latest book, Gawimara Gathering, is a work of poetry, but you know you've historically written sort of hybridized kind of short story cycle memoir, and I promise I'm not just being ambivalent. Purple Threads is a complex book to place in terms of genre. You know, and you're a critic as well. And so I wonder, working and moving across multiple forms and mediums, but with a constant engagement with the style, the methods, the intentions, the contexts of other works, whether they be other First Nations works, but also as a teacher you do focus a lot on, you know, culturally and linguistically diverse writers. I wonder, again, this question of how do you locate certain stories and practices in form, and do you feel that that is something that's in dialogue with all of these writers that you work on and with in your criticism?
Wow, that was
a long question, yes, I'm sorry.
that's right. Questions as long as the river that I used to live on. Okay, Yurudu Marang, everyone, and UND Janine Wiradjuri Ninga Gundagai Di. Hello, my name's Janine Wiradjuri, woman from the Murrumbidgee River near Gundagai. And also acknowledge that I'm here today on stolen lands. Acknowledging solidarity with all stolen lands today, and also acknowledging solidarity today with Palestine, occupied Palestine. Thanks for the question. Okay, you mentioned gathering, or Gawimara, which is a Wiradjuri word for gathering, or to gather. And so I wrote in Gathering, and it might be better if I read the excerpt perhaps, that before I write another poem, I'll stop and consider the violence of the paper that it's written on. And that's a poem in itself. And history is not the past. History isn't even what happens. history is just another story labelled as a truth. And in the acknowledgements, I think, which is what relates to Evelyn's question as well, all these things relate to Evelyn's question, I'll draw them together, I hope, is that I said this collection, like a lot of the work I do, is simply a moment which is part of a much bigger momentum of people, particularly of Wiradjuri matriarchs, but also writing matriarchs, and elders, ancestors, and other First Nations people who have actually been part of this big gathering journey. My work concerns itself very much with the transitions between orality and writing, or to writing. So, like having been raised by a community of speakers, there's heaps of responsibility in a story, or in any kind of writing. So, like responsibility among a community of speakers. And I think I've spent a lot of time in an institution of some kind or other, like a classroom or a school or a university, and thinking a lot about the kind of things that the body of writing that we've inherited as English doesn't really do right in a cultural perspective. And I guess one of those is like what I think about around the politics of recognition, which is like acknowledging where you're getting your story and your stance and your kind of grounding, or where are you getting your locality from? You know, like Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So maybe if I put that in a Wiradjuri philosophy, it might be like, I'm located, grounded, therefore I am. So there is this responsibility of the politics of recognition in all types of storytelling that I think was kind of lacking in a lot of, well, totally lacking in the kind of writing that I got used to, or that I inherited. And also, so as a teacher, I'm more concerned, which doesn't mean I'm not concerned with the craft of writing, but I'm more concerned with the ethics of writing, and the ethics of the story and the standpoint of the storyteller and the positionality. I think perhaps First Nations peoples, other peoples of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds who are minorities, can feel the legacy of unethical writing and unethical representation. Well, not can, do actually kind of live with these things on a regular basis. So I'm concerned, yeah, craft is important in writing. Like craft is important in the kind of story that people tell, but it is also secondary to the questions that you should be asking about the kind of story that you're telling to start with. And yeah, I think Evelyn mentioned this kind of cross-generic writing that I do. I'm conscious about the limits of genre, because if someone tells you a story, it's a story. You don't say, hello, is this fiction or non-fiction, or do you want to give me a category for this story? That's very kind of like a post-colonial way of looking at stories. I think it's the strength of any story is in its form. And just before I go on too long, Evelyn mentioned also literary critique, criticism, which is a growing body, but it is very much the underrated side of any kind of creative work, is the kind of culturally grounded critique that is needed to sustain it. And it's one thing to have this really important creative canon of First Nations literature, canon of creative First Nations literature, something like that. But it's also equally important to have the same kind of like culturally grounded body of literature, of critique to go with it. And all bodies of literature, whether it's settler literature or whatever kind of literature it is also very much dependent on a healthy body of equally culturally grounded, culturally rigorous literary analysis. And it's probably the less perhaps I think people are thinking a bit differently about it now, but that's been a slow train. But, it has really probably been the least sexy side of writing is literary critique. And cultural rigour in literary critique, which is also kind of like, I actually wrote an essay called Cultural Rigour, which is about, culturally grounded language for literary critique for First Nations work. Okay, I might stop there too, thanks.
Thank you. Now, and thank you each for those answers, because that was all incredibly rich and detailed. We've had Uncle Kim and Auntie Janine have both spoken about history. Auntie Julie, that's also a deep part of your work and your practice, archival research building up as a kind of a foreground for missing, sublimated, never told stories. And the role of the imagination is obviously something really crucial in resisting the silencing of different historical and colonial narratives and archives. I wonder if you could talk about the particular challenges, yes, in terms of ethics, but also really I'm really curious about what are the challenges as a writer practitioner in writing those stories and representations at the level of your own sense of that authenticity and, and those representations being able to achieve more than just saying, yes, we were here, but saying we are felt and experienced and deeply human.
I wrote my first historical novel, Benevolence, as a reply to Kate Grenfell's The Secret River. When I saw the play adapted from the novel by Andrew Bavell in Adelaide and both in Sydney, I would end watching that play in tears rolling down my face. Not because the scene of the massacre was so much that it was a dramatised scene of a massacre on stage, which you don't really want to see, but because the novel had pretended that it was from the Darug point of view, and it was the people being massacred were Burrabirungal people. But they never had names. They were like flora and fauna in the novel. Andrew Bavell at least worked with Darug informants to give them some names. But I got incredibly angry because I actually knew the history of the Hawkesbury River very well, because I'd worked with Professor Peter Reid for 5 years on the History of Aboriginal Sydney website, which is still live, and it's got it's got hundreds of interviews and historical documents and photographs and drawings. It's still a live website. And I actually knew in detail the history of the Hawkesbury River. And so the fact that that book ended up being, The Secret River ended up being in every school child's hands in Australia infuriated me, because I felt that it was such a false voice. And it was because of that anger I was able to write Benevolence. And then after I wrote Benevolence, I've just written the sequel to that called Compassion. And I decided to write from the Aboriginal point of view the history of the Hawkesbury River through the eyes of my ancestors. And I'd had the privilege of interviewing so many elders due to the University of Sydney History Project, the History of Aboriginal Sydney. And I'd had the privilege of hearing their stories from the Blue Mountains, down to Windsor, down to Blacktown, right into Redfern. And I was not surprised, but interested to see kind of how similar their family stories of the stories of their ancestors of what happened to people in the Sydney area, which is ground zero for colonialism and invasion, was so similar to my own family's. And so I was able to draw on the energy from those elders to reconstruct a history which I found very hard to find in the archives. If you're related to a really famous Aboriginal person, there's a lot of information. You know, if I was, you know, descendant of Maria Locke, who was the first landholder out there on Richmond Road, I'm actually related through my family, through marriage to Maria Locke. But finding my own ancestors was like needles in the haystack, because they were illiterate, they often didn't have birth certificates, they often didn't have marriage certificates, children were taken by the Benevolent Society and never seen again. And I was looking, so in the end the creative energy of my creativity was that I would write the story as how I kind of could imagine it. And but luckily when I came to write the sequel to Benevolence, which is Compassion, only came out on the 2nd of March, so I'm very proud of that. Mugaballa, go Mugaballa. And I was able to, I looked up the 2 times great-grandmother called Mary Thomas in Trove, and I found 3 things about Mary Thomas. Right?
Can you tell us the 3 things?
Yeah, I will tell you the 3 things. Funny about that. The first time she was in the magistrate's court in Windsor for stealing 9 fowls, right? And after that, every time my husband saw me in a really daggy brown dress, he'd come up and he'd write with his finger, "She stole 9 fowls," you know? The shift from the, you know, the asylum or something, he'd say. And the next time she's in the archives at all, and you can look this up in Trove, you know, is that she's up in the magistrate's court again. She got off the first time in the Windsor Magistrate's Court, and she stole a herd of cattle with her assistant, or the man with it was called Henry Thomas, and I think that was her father, but I'm not too sure. He ended up in the Parramatta Insane Asylum for 5 years for that particular thing. She got off again. The next time she appears in the Windsor Magistrates Court, 3rd time, which is in about 1846, she's up for stealing a herd of horses.
I love her.
Yeah, I love her too. And that was a hanging offence, you know, in that era, in the colonial, outside of colonial Australia, hanging offence. And I thought, what a woman, you know. And she got off again, and she didn't end up in jail. And I just had to think about how on earth did she get out of going to jail. And I thought, my dad had the gift of the gab, fantastic storyteller. I've got the gift of the gab. I'm not a bad storyteller. I figured she had the gift of the gab, and she just talked her way out, and she pretended she was, oh, you know, they led me astray and I don't know. And she used every kind of theatrical cunning to get out of being put in prison. But also she used sexism of the day in order to not end up in the asylum or the prison, where so many Aboriginal men were killed and murdered in the prisons and prison and asylum system. But you know, that passion for history is what made me a person who writes historical fiction. But the other side of me too, because writing fiction, it's like what Janine has said in here and Kim has said, is that doing the research and the language research and the talking to community and the protocols is hard work. It doesn't just come like that. You have to do the respectful work. Even if you're working about stories about your own mob, there still is an absolute requirement to show that respectful and do the respectful research and the protocols and talk to elders. But I sandwiched it with a crime novel called Maduka, the River Serpent, to give myself a breath of fresh air. And that was a revelation too, but that's another story.
So, descendant of a woman who progressively stole cooler and more things, found comfort in writing a crime novel as a breath of fresh air. Okay, all right. Okay, be careful how we frame that one. The Age is probably going to want to turn that into some kind of smack job. But that is a delightful story, and thank you so much for sharing that. I had no idea we were going to go there, but I'm jumping on Trove very soon. Thank you for that. Uncle Kim, you have been working, I'm finding a way of weaving this in, but you've been working archivally, of course, as you always have really in your entire career, but you've also been working with song and with, you know, speaking of multiple forms and modes. I wonder if this is enough of a segue to lead into what we had previously discussed in terms of the work that you've been doing across...
It could be, but it might... I've got the book now.
You've got the book now.
So-
Well, we've got another back up there. So
Yes,
do you like...
and it might take time to set it up.
Okay. Well, what I would love, and you can choose whichever interpretation in terms of the action that you want, is what I would love would be for you to talk about or perform or do some form of me telling you what I want, talking about something specific in your practice that you've enjoyed doing, especially if it was difficult. I'm really interested in, as I said, I feel that you're a precise writer, and it was really interesting to me that you made that comment that so much of the work you feel is improvised. And I really would never, I've read all of your books, and I really never would have felt that there was any level of improvisation. To me, there's almost this kind of like mathematical equation to the way in which, you know, your sentences seem constructed and your representations of particularly characters, right? I think you invest a lot of energy into really interesting, compelling representations of characters. And I'd love to hear about the process of that construction and the process of building up a you know...
Yeah, the improvisation is definitely there, because that's, I think, for me, the best moments of writing is when you're in the zone and you, where have I been? You know, you look up. It's very rare in my experience, but sometimes they're the bits where where you find the heart of the creative work, and then the precision on those other things are about bringing those wonderful, in the composition, bringing those bits together and how you can link them, and also anticipating readers and the context in which work will be read. So that's where the precision might come in, and the attention to craft and so on. I wasn't aware of the complex sentences. I know I like rhythm. It's usually rhythms that are driving my sentences, I think.
No, but I think that's complexity, right? Like, I don't necessarily mean complex in the sense that, like, you've got a sentence that's like a Faulknerian kind of page-long thing, right? But a sentence that doesn't feel, casually strewn
Sometimes
about.
you want to turn a reader on themselves.
Well,
too.
you brought up, you brought up the opening line, the opening line, Benang, right? That's a startling open line. I remember reading it myself as an undergraduate, and I was in that angry blackfella phase, right, where I was very much like, no, I'm not even anything else. I'm just an Aboriginal person, and to see such a, I didn't know if it was irony. I didn't know if it was, if it was a sort of, satire. I really couldn't place.
And I
it
wasn't sure myself when I, but there was just there's an enormous amount of energy in just writing it down, and then where am I going to go from here? And also it foregrounded the prevalence of that phrase in the archive language, in terms of claiming land, the first white man born, the last full-blood Aborigine, that business, and then seeing that in the A.O. Neville's Australia's Coloured Minority, a man who'd been for 3 decades chief protector of Aborigines. It's the same sort of thing, draw a line. So the energy of that, I thought, it's brave, and where can I go? And then improvising where, and then building on that. I like that way. I like that way of working. But I'm also very slow, and one of us mentioned imposter syndrome when we're in the back here. And I'm very aware, coming here to talk of the craft of writing, that my last novel was 2017.
It's a good book, though.
You're hardly an imposter.
But part of that is trying to be useful. So the working with song has been part of that, and to selfish reasons, I want to learn the old Noongar songs, but then who are you going to sing them to, and who else needs to learn them? And in one instance, the fella I was on the native title stuff with, Uncle Lomas Roberts, had left me with these recordings. He sang with another nephew of his. And none of his kids know them, all due respect to these people. But now one of his daughters, Gay Roberts, knows 4 or 5 of those songs of his, and we perform them as a group. So that sort of, in terms of your literary chops, that feels really powerful. You know, here she's not in the professional world, but singing her dad's songs and singing them sometimes in front of, we've done it with a couple of hundred people, a few hundred people. And her pride, that's, you know, I feel like, well, that's good work, that's the stuff to do. And I get to learn them myself, which, of course, you know, I like. But then also, and I hope this makes sense, also not all her siblings have learned those songs. So at what point do you start? So I try with the language revival, or whatever the term is, appropriate term, I try and work with return and consolidation of this material, as I think it, to its home community. And then you've got these widening circles where, and these are cliches, but I've had to think it through a bit, and then empowering those individuals through sharing it, because it gives you a buzz. You know, here's my old people's songs, and you know, they operate in the affective domain. They got power, I think, even if you're not understanding all the words. So that's part of the work that distracts me, perhaps, from writing novels. But for me, it's all much of a muchness. I write a lot to explore and to think things through, and to quite aggressively, but in a sort of gentle way, you know, take on some of these other voices, find a sensibility that seems more appropriate within language to how I feel, encountering history or the contemporary world and the place of my sort of Aboriginal people. I'm losing it here.
No,
Come
I'm
in
just...
and fix things up.
That
Evelyn.
revival of language is such important work, and I think when I first read Kim's book and The Dead Man Dance and the use of language, and it kind of lit up my imagination of, you know, I can do this for Darug language. You know, I'd already been doing it in my plays when I work with Biripi people, but so, you know, a real inspiration. Don't ever think that wasn't important. You know, gosh, very important.
And as well, I think something that's been nice that's been coming across is that you've all spoken about yourselves as still learning, and especially with language too. You know, you're all from generations where your parents and grandparents would not have been legally in any kind of institutional environment been allowed to speak language, and so recognising that pathway back to language is not a given, and that, you know, my generation, we can now go to a TAFE class and we can do that. And actually, Auntie Janine, you've been doing Wiradjuri language, and that's been in your work for a long time in various ways. But it is in Gawimara. But what I want to highlight as well and ask you about is that's not. Again, you know, I'm using the word precision, but there's also such a particular structure of honouring that is brought in. You know, you have multiple poems to women and to older Aboriginal women in your life and in your community, whether they be Wiradjuri or Aranda, or, you know, many other nations that you've worked with collectively over the years. But I wonder, you know, writing now and writing while still learning in that space, and learning and teaching and writing, I want to ask you about 2 through lines in Gawimara particularly, one being those dialogue poems with other, you know, older Aboriginal women and women that you consider to be elders as well, but also the inevitable kind of space you need to clear to do that with poems like Forced into Images and The Historians, and the work of refuting colonial narratives as you do that honouring.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay. This book or any of the books I do, but to date, this is not overly well acknowledged in commercial publishing or literary circles. Not necessarily implicating the writers, but now we're all talking about it. So, but yeah, look, is that kind of politics of recognition? A new book is treated like it just fell out of the sky, and it never did actually. There is a huge kind of intergenerational politics of recognition there behind that kind of work. And so yeah, in this book, because I'll just use this as an example because I've got it here on stage and because Evelyn talked about it, there's several poems in here to women, including my Guni Narong, that's my grandmother, Guni, who's my mother. There's also poems to writing matriarchs like Annie Carey Reid Gilbert, and three particularly long poems that were a long time in coming because the cultural process of writing these poems, and I think all the poems in this book are non-fiction, right? Which is something that people don't, a bit more now, but haven't really thought about poetry as something either outside fiction or non-fiction or either. But I think, you know, it's important to think about poetry as that kind of, the work that poetry does as that kind of factual story or true story. I hate the word factual. True story that history doesn't do. So yeah, there's poems in here to Auntie Jenny Martiniello, Kimara Martiniello, about the work she's done with story and weaving glass. That's what the poem's called, Weaving Glass. There's also a poem in here to my sister cousin Tracy Phillips, whose sister was Sandra Phillips, who grew up at a time, I suppose, with me, and that's a poem about nation, and through my sister cousin Tracy's life, you can read a lot of statement about the nation and the state of the nation. And I guess, and these three poems kind of thread the work because it's divided into three sections, and the feature of each section is these long dialogic bio poems to the women, and the last one is for Arnie Elaine Lomas called Your Smile is a River, and who is the one who took me to begin with on my writing, my language journey, to go back and get a language that should have been my birthright. And so that, and the fact that we can speak that language now and have kept that language is due to that great Gari Māori or gathering, mostly that the women do, that I'd like to kind of centre in my writing. And also because we talked about imagination, yeah, well, the word makes me nervous because a lot of dangerous things have been done with imaginations, like the wild colonial imagination when it comes to black bodies, black women, black people. It's really uninformed. Yeah, I think your imagination's got to be informed a bit by, Julie gave a classic example of what I'm talking about, how she didn't actually know the great-great-grandmother who had such a gift of the gad that she talked her way out of all these legal situations, but she does have this information about her now that's on a colonial record that she could do something with, because that's her blood and that's how that's informing the imagination. I think talking about an imagination as a kind of unhinged, out there thing that floats around waiting for people to pick it is a bit of a dangerous thing as well, because imaginations are as culturally grounded as the people who own them.
Thank you. So we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left, and so this is a big question to be asking, too big of a question really to be asking to get to it properly. But I'm curious about your thoughts, each of your thoughts on the continuing limitations that black writers do have, and I'm sure you've all seen these change over the course of your careers. That change hasn't been, you know, that's not a given change. It's change that's been worked for. In regards to the right of black creative experimentation and pressing of boundaries and work across seemingly kind of, you know, prohibited forms and such, right? You know, especially, Aunty Janine, I'm thinking here of all of your PhD research into the white imaginary and how that constructed this historical notion of, you know, the Aborigine, which exists only in history and can't ever really be embodied. And you've each engaged and critiqued and spoken back to that history. But I wonder what you think as black writers now. What are, you know, do you think you do have full freedom with craft, or do you still feel that you experience that pushback from, whether it be from publishers or from industry, that is trying to limit what you're able to do as practitioners?
Can I answer that? Yeah. For me, I'd had a reasonable career as a playwright. Had 2 plays on at Belvoir Street, had a play on in America, I had 10 productions in Australia. But then I had a number of plays that got sort of shortlisted for the Patrick White Award or something and never got productions. And I ended up with several plays in the drawer, and I was sick to death of having to raise my own money and, you know, pay the actors and produce it, clean the toilets, make the cakes, sell the tickets, you do everything in theatre. And so I switched to writing novels, and I think I stupidly thought, oh, that'll be so much easier, you know, right, it'll be really great, you know. And I've often asked, what's the difference between being a playwright and a novelist? Playwright, you're hanging around in the theatre, you're wearing a leather jacket, sexy actors are buying you drinks, you're buying them drinks, and you're part of the acting world and the drama theatre world, and you feel kind of, you know, top of the world, even if it's only 10 people in the audience. And then as a novelist, you're sitting alone in your slippers in a darkened room for 2 years, feeling deeply depressed.
2 years?
Having a whole 10 years in some cases, having a whole room with a wallpaper of rejection slips, you know, in the days when they used to send you letters, and thinking, what the hell why? Why am I doing this to myself? Am I some kind of masochist, you know? But I hear in public forums, oh, so much easier for Indigenous writers to get published these days. And I think, no, the writers I know, very gifted writers who still really struggle to get published. It's just simply not true. And often the gatekeepers in big publishing houses, they're all a certain sort of European-based...
Oh, yeah, they're white.
Yeah.
Oh, I think we're allowed to say that here.
Or women, often women who've
Middle
been to,
class.
you know, Frensham or somewhere nice, and they've had
Upper
a nice
class.
private school. Upper class. And, you know, and they're looking down from a real height. Look, it's still, they're still the gatekeepers. And thank heavens for Mugabulla. And I just met some wonderful women from Central Australia who got the Running Waters Press in Alice Springs. Thank heavens for those women standing up and publishing the poems from their own people. I just think it's always a struggle, but I'm not saying any writer from any background, it isn't a struggle, and you've got to be half mad to want to do it. But when you do get a reward, you get to be in places like this, and people are nice to you, and they make you cups of tea, and they say, "Auntie, can I get you a chair?" And you actually get to meet wonderful readers as well, and you meet fantastic writers. That for me is the privilege. But I think it is a hard road, and the only answer to it is you have to be completely obsessed by your work. And as Kim said, when you're hot and you're on a roll, it's fantastic because it really flows. But a lot of the time it's just solid rewriting, and working with the most fantastic editors. I always take my hat off to editors. I worked with Ali Al-Zizi at Mugaballa, and I worked with the wonderful Jane Messer, who I received through a mentorship in the Australian Society of Authors. Always a good mentorship to go to because they're looking for people that are unpublished often. And without the help of those professionals, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
Thank you. Kim, did you want to jump in?
Pushback?
Yeah.
Is there pushback? And look, it's there is everywhere. It's not just in literature. I think it's one of the responsibilities as a writer, a creative practitioner, a Noongar creative practitioner, is to expand the possibilities, the sort of roles, the ways of being. Firstly, in my instance, I think firstly for Noongars, especially those where there's love and trust, and then to expand it out from there. We need, one can talk about the psychosis in the nation state, Australian nation state, and its relationship with Aboriginal Australia. That needs to be fixed and sorted. It doesn't appear to be able to occur through legislation and politics, however effective that is. So those of us here try and do it through writing. And of course there is an industry, even the fact that there has emerged, a niche, I'd call it, if not a ghetto, of black writing, is in itself a problem. And I think we want to try and get out of there and bring others with us. For me, I try and understand, with some of that pushback, and how much can you give ground. Again, that First White Man Born stuff is trying to do that. I'll give a bit of ground and see if I can regain it big time. So that negotiating with audiences or publishing houses or whatever, that's always on. The dangers now are a bit, we might not have been able to get in before, but now one of our issues, it seems to me, is not to fit too easily into the niche. They often, and this again, I mentioned Madruru Noongar, Colin Johnson before, it's quite convenient for the Academy and the White Academy to have angry blackfellas, So, sometimes it seems as if audiences want to be shouted at, almost, but that's not the way literature works, that intimacy of creating a story and expanding space together. So it's those sort of negotiations. There are frustrations at the level of industry, but we've made ground. We've got to make sure we don't trap and ambush ourselves, I think.
Thank you. Auntie Janine?
I think we're just about out of time, but the purpose of culturally rigorous First Nations critique, and our biggest limiter is the market and the publisher. The purpose of culturally rigorous First Nations literary criticism is to assert systems of cultural value that are beyond those determined by the colonial mainstream and set by the market. And a further aim of that is to challenge the absolutely rife celebrity colonialism in publishing and marketing that seeks to sell a particular black stereotype or brand of black story at any particular time and place at the expense of ignoring the diversity and the intersectionality of other black stories and life experiences in First Nations communities. And after this panel, if you go away and think really hard, you could probably come up with a list of what's the selling black stories kind of thing at the moment. And that's not necessarily the black story. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just complimenting you.
Thank you. Yeah, a bit of a serious note to end it on, but yeah, it's the market force, and if any kind of culturally rigorous writing has, in our communities, has any role, it is to assert a system of values that are beyond and above what's driven by the market, and to look at what are the stories that are out there not being told. And if you're advocating for First Nations stories and you've already got some space, a good advocate always makes themselves redundant. So maybe we could all relinquish a bit of space for stories that are not there. Manda Guru, thank you.
Thank you. And can we give an amazing round of applause for our incredible speakers, Annie Janine, Uncle Kim, Uncle Annie Julie. Thank you so much for coming.
And Evelyn Araluen, wonderful
Yeah.
facilitator.
Thanks to the chair.
Please enjoy the rest of the festival and support Black literature and Black writing. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Evelyn. Thanks, Evelyn.
And the rest of you?